November 1944. Bougainville Island. American machine guns were firing tens of thousands of rounds every night and killing almost no one. The problem wasn't accuracy, it wasn't training, and it wasn't courage. The enemy wasn't in front of them, he was under them. Japanese sappers were tunneling toward American lines, moving unseen beneath dirt, timber, and volcanic rock. Standard 30-06 ammunition did exactly what it was designed to do: penetrate flesh. Against earth and fortifications, it did nothing. You could empty belt after belt into the jungle and still lose the position before dawn. Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna was watching it happen, night after night. The digging moved closer. No targets, no muzzle flashes, just grenades and satchel charges appearing from the ground itself. Then McKenna loaded a different belt into his M1919 Browning. The rounds looked ordinary. They weren't. Each bullet carried a compact incendiary charge designed to detonate on impact. When it struck wood, rock, or packed earth, it didn't just punch through, it exploded. A violent flash, a concussive shock, burning metal fragments ripping apart cover that had absorbed thousands of normal rounds. Every bullet became an event. Tunnel entrances collapsed. Timber supports ignited. Underground positions that had been untouchable minutes earlier were suddenly death traps. The Japanese noticed immediately. They called it Kaminari-ju, the thunder machine. The orange flash gave away nothing except one message: the ground was no longer safe. In sectors where American units had once expended more than 60,000 rounds for a single confirmed casualty, fights were now decided with fewer than 200. This is the story of the ammunition that solved a problem: infantry. Weapons were never meant to solve, developed in months, deployed in secrecy, feared by those who faced it, and then quietly erased when the war ended. By late 1944, American commanders in the Pacific were confronting a contradiction they couldn't explain. On paper, they had overwhelming firepower: machine guns, mortars, artillery, ammunition stockpiles measured in the millions. Yet night after night, positions were being breached by forces that were barely visible and often not visible at all. The Japanese were no longer fighting above ground. They were fighting from underneath it. Tunnel warfare wasn't new. American units had encountered caves and dugouts throughout the Pacific campaign, but by 1944, Japanese engineers had refined the concept into something far more dangerous. On islands like Bougainville, tunnels weren't simple hiding places. They were interconnected systems reinforced with timber, packed earth, and volcanic rock designed to allow movement, storage, and surprise attacks without ever exposing the defender. From the American perspective, it created a nightmare. Firepower depends on targets, and targets depend on visibility. But tunnels erased both. A machine gun team could dominate open ground all day. At night, that same ground became meaningless. Japanese sappers would dig forward silently, sometimes for days, advancing beneath American lines without detection. When they emerged, it wasn't with prolonged firefights. It was with grenades, satchel charges, and close-range chaos just long enough to cause damage before vanishing back underground. And once they disappeared, there was nothing to shoot. American doctrine assumed that sustained fire could suppress an enemy position. That assumption collapsed in jungle terrain. Standard 30-06 ball ammunition worked exactly as it was engineered to work. It penetrated exposed human targets with lethal efficiency. But when fired into earth, wood, and layered vegetation, its effectiveness dropped to near zero. Bullets buried themselves in soil. They splintered logs without collapsing them. They passed through leaves and vines that concealed nothing and revealed even less. After-action reports from earlier island battles began to show disturbing ratios. Tens of thousands of machine gun rounds expended for a single confirmed casualty. In some sectors, entire belts were emptied into suspected tunnel entrances with no observable effect. The ammunition wasn't defective. The weapons weren't obsolete. The environment had changed the rules. On Bougainville, this reality played out every night. Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna commanded a machine gun position on the edge of the American perimeter. During daylight, his field of fire looked ideal open ground, separating his position from the jungle tree line. At night, it became an illusion. The jungle swallowed sound. The ground swallowed movement, and the enemy swallowed distance. McKenna didn't see Japanese soldiers approaching. He heard them. The scraping of tools against packed earth, the faint rhythm of digging carried through the ground itself. It was a sound that couldn't be engaged, only anticipated. Standard procedure offered no solution. You didn't fire blindly at nothing. Ammunition was heavy, barrels overheated, and indiscriminate fire revealed your position without neutralizing the threat. Yet doing nothing meant waiting for the moment the tunnels reached the wire. When they did, the advantage flipped instantly. Grenades appeared from holes that hadn't existed minutes earlier. Explosions tore through defensive positions, and before American units could react, the attackers were gone, leaving damage, casualties, and uncertainty behind. The ground itself had become a weapon. American forces tried everything available to counter it. Flamethrowers could clear tunnels, but only at dangerously close range, where operators were exposed to concentrated fire. Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges required soldiers to crawl within feet of concealed entrances. Artillery could collapse caves, but only if observers could identify exact locations, something rarely possible in dense jungle. Each solution carried an unacceptable cost, and none of them addressed the core problem. You could not suppress what you could not see. This wasn't a failure of courage or discipline. It was a mismatch between weapons designed for open battlefields and a form of warfare that removed the battlefield entirely. By the fall of 1944, American units weren't losing because they lacked firepower. They were losing because firepower, as it existed, had no way to reach the enemy. McKenna understood this intuitively. Night after night, he listened as the digging moved closer. The distance shortened. The pauses grew longer. The silence more deliberate. There were no muzzle flashes to guide fire, no silhouettes to track, no warning until the moment of contact. The situation demanded something that didn't yet exist in doctrine. Not a new tactic, not more men, and not heavier weapons. It required a way to make bullets matter again, not against soldiers, but against the spaces they relied on to survive. McKenna didn't know that such a solution already existed. He only knew that the standard tools had failed, and that whatever was happening beneath the ground would reach him soon. The problem wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. American units didn't need new doctrine written in manuals. They needed something that worked that night, in that jungle, against an enemy who had learned how to disappear, and they didn't have time to design a new weapon. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department understood this reality clearly. Entire island campaigns were being slowed, not by lack of firepower, but by the enemy's ability to survive beneath it. Designing a new infantry weapon would take years. Manufacturing it would take longer. Training troops to use it would take longer still. None of that helped the men listening to digging under their feet. The only viable option was modification. Not changing what soldiers carried, but changing what those weapons could do. The M1919 Browning machine gun was the obvious candidate. It was already everywhere. Tens of thousands were in service across the Pacific. Every infantry company knew how to operate it, maintain it, and keep it firing under brutal conditions. If the problem could be solved at the level of ammunition, the solution could spread instantly, without retraining, without new logistics, without delay. What almost no one expected was where the answer would come from. It didn't originate with infantry officers. It didn't come from jungle warfare specialists. And it didn't come from field commanders desperate for results. It came from engineers studying a completely different battlefield. Back in the United States, at testing grounds and ordnance facilities far removed from Bougainville's mud and darkness, analysts were examining anti-aircraft ammunition. In air defense roles, machine guns didn't fire uniform rounds. They fired specialized projectiles, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, each designed to solve a specific problem. Aircraft weren't defeated by penetration alone. They were defeated by effects: ignition, fragmentation, shock. That observation raised a dangerous question. If explosive and incendiary effects could be scaled down for aircraft targets, could the same principle be applied to infantry weapons? Not to kill soldiers directly, but to destroy the material protecting them. The idea bordered on impractical. A 30-06 cartridge didn't leave much room for experimentation. Once you accounted for the propellant needed to maintain velocity and stability, there was almost no space left for anything else. Any additional component risked destabilizing the projectile, reducing accuracy, or causing catastrophic failure inside the weapon. And there was another concern. Infantry weapons weren't designed to fire explosive projectiles. A malfunction inside a machine gun barrel didn't just disable the weapon, it killed the crew operating it. The margin for error was unforgiving. Yet the problem demanded risk. Engineers began working on a redesigned projectile, one that would preserve external ballistics while introducing a controlled effect on impact. The solution wasn't brute force, it was precision. Instead of relying on sheer explosive power, the design focused on reaction. The concept was simple in theory and difficult in execution: a projectile that behaved like standard ammunition in flight, but responded violently when it struck solid material. Not flesh, not air, but wood, rock, and packed earth. To make that work, the projectile had to remain stable, survive the violence of firing, and then activate only when it decelerated rapidly upon impact. It required engineering tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Months of testing followed. Early prototypes failed. Some detonated too early. Others failed to detonate at all. A few destroyed test barrels outright. But gradually, the balance was found. A projectile slightly heavier than standard ball ammunition. A compact, incendiary explosive mixture. A percussion mechanism sensitive enough to trigger on impact but stable enough to survive firing. On paper, it was a compromise. In practice, it was something else entirely. Initial testing against simulated fortifications produced results that startled observers. Rounds that previously disappeared harmlessly into timber now blasted fist-sized cavities through it. Earth-packed walls fractured instead of absorbing energy. Most importantly, the impact produced a visible flash brief, violent, unmistakable. For the first time, machine gun fire created its own illumination. Suppressive fire stopped being abstract. It became undeniable. There were still risks. Barrel temperatures had to be managed carefully. Sustained fire could lead to dangerous conditions. Ammunition storage posed challenges in humid environments. Cost per round was significantly higher than standard ball ammunition, but none of those concerns outweighed the alternative. The alternative was continuing to fight an enemy you couldn't reach. By mid-1944, limited production runs were authorized. The ammunition wasn't given a dramatic name. It wasn't advertised as a breakthrough. It was marked quietly, documented sparsely, and shipped forward without ceremony. No training films, no doctrinal updates, just a technical bulletin and a warning: fire in controlled bursts. That was how it reached the Pacific. That was how it reached Bougainville. When Staff Sergeant McKenna received the new ammunition, he wasn't told it would change the balance of night fighting. He wasn't briefed on its origins or its engineering. He was given belts that felt heavier in his hands and a single instruction: use it carefully. At that moment, it was just another attempt, another adjustment, another hope that something, anything, might finally reach the enemy underground. McKenna had no way of knowing that what he was about to load into his machine gun would do more than solve his immediate problem. It would expose a weakness in subterranean warfare that no one had fully understood yet, and it would do so in a way that couldn't be ignored. The moment the first round struck, something solid in the dark, the digging stopped shortly before dawn. That was never a good sign. For days, the sound had been constant, faint, rhythmic, easy to track if you stayed still long enough. Picks against earth, shovels against packed soil. The noise carried through the ground more than the air. When it stopped, It meant the sappers were close enough to listen. Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna checked his watch. A few minutes before 5 a.m., the darkest part of the night, too late for moonlight, too early for dawn. That was when tunnel attacks usually came. McKenna lay behind the M1919, his weight pressed into the mud. The gun was loaded with a mixed belt, mostly standard ball ammunition, punctuated at regular intervals with the new rounds. He hadn't altered his position. He hadn't alerted the rest of the line. There was no reason to. Nothing had happened yet. The jungle ahead was a solid wall of black. The open ground between the perimeter and the tree line looked empty, but experience had taught him better. The enemy didn't need to cross it. They would come from underneath it. A faint metallic sound cut through the silence. One of the warning cans tied to the perimeter wire had been disturbed, not by an animal, not by wind. McKenna tightened his grip. Standard doctrine said to wait for a visible target. Don't fire blind. Don't waste ammunition. Don't reveal your position unless you can achieve effect. That doctrine had already failed him for 4 nights straight. He leaned into the stock and depressed the trigger. The M1919 came alive, its familiar rhythm tearing into the darkness. The first rounds were standard ball ammunition. They vanished forward with the usual crack, sharp, clean, and ultimately meaningless. Then one of the new rounds struck something solid. The effect was immediate. A sharp, orange flash burst in the jungle, roughly 200 yards out. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. In that instant, McKenna saw more than he had seen all week. A fallen log splintered apart, palm fronds thrown sideways, and a human figure dropping low, scrambling away from the light. The darkness closed again. McKenna adjusted his aim and fired another short burst. 2 seconds later, another flash, slightly to the right. This time it illuminated a different shape, a circular opening reinforced with timber, a tunnel entrance, half hidden by vegetation. The ground itself had revealed the enemy. McKenna didn't hesitate. He fired a longer burst. 20 rounds. 4 of them were the new ammunition. Each impact produced its own flash. Not random, not chaotic. Each one briefly sketched the terrain, tree trunks, earthworks, movement. The jungle stopped being invisible. Something caught fire near the tunnel entrance. Dry wood. Old reinforcement beams. Flames spread quickly, feeding on the same concealment that had protected the position minutes earlier. Now McKenna could see. Figures ran for the tunnel. One stumbled. Another disappeared into the opening. A third didn't make it back. One of the explosive rounds detonated close enough to throw burning fragments sideways. McKenna watched a sapper clutch his side and fall. The wound didn't bleed the way gunshots usually did. It glowed faintly in the dark. His assistant gunner stared. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. McKenna didn't answer. He shifted fire again, this time toward a second suspected entrance farther left. Another burst, more flashes. The jungle erupted in brief, violent bursts of light like a line of firecrackers tearing through the night. The effect was no longer subtle. The enemy was no longer protected by darkness or earth. Standard ball rounds forced movement. The new rounds destroyed the places movement depended on. Within minutes, the firing stopped. Not because McKenna ran out of ammunition, not because the barrel overheated. There was simply nothing left to shoot at. The open ground ahead burned in scattered patches. The tunnel entrance had partially collapsed. The tree line beyond it was silent. McKenna checked his belt. He had fired fewer than 200 rounds. The rest of the perimeter had gone quiet. Other machine gun crews had ceased fire to watch what was happening on his sector. They had never seen a .30 caliber weapon do that. An officer crawled forward through the trench. He took one look at the burning jungle and turned back toward McKenna. "What kind of ammunition are you using?" he asked. McKenna shrugged. "New stuff," he said. "Came in yesterday. 8 Frist. They didn't advance beyond the wire until first light." Nobody did after a night engagement. Not even to confirm kills. When dawn finally broke, the damage became clear. The primary tunnel entrance was partially collapsed. The wooden supports had burned through. Loose earth had caved in on itself. Inside the tunnel, just visible from the perimeter, were bodies. A second entrance had collapsed completely. Fire had spread through internal supports, causing a structural failure that sealed the passage. Across the open ground lay several more bodies. Some showed standard gunshot wounds. Others bore something different, burn injuries and embedded fragments that had scorched through clothing and into flesh. The after-action report was brief. Approximately 180 rounds expended. 12 confirmed enemy casualties. 2 tunnel systems destroyed or rendered unusable. No American casualties during the engagement. For comparison, previous tunnel clearing attempts in the same sector had required thousands of rounds and resulted in multiple wounded. Word spread quickly, not through official channels, not through reports or bulletins. Through soldiers, machine gun crews began asking for the heavier belts. Supply sergeants noticed the requests. Officers took notes. No one called it revolutionary, but everyone understood the same thing. For the first time in weeks, the ground had stopped protecting the enemy, and the jungle, once silent and impenetrable, had given up its secrets, one flash at a time. The effect didn't stay confined to McKenna's position. It never does. In war, nothing spreads faster than proof. By mid-morning, officers from neighboring sectors had already walked the perimeter. They didn't need diagrams or explanations. The collapsed tunnel entrances said everything. So did the burn marks. So did the bodies lying where no bodies were supposed to be visible. Machine gun crews noticed something else. For the first time, the enemy had broken contact without returning fire. That didn't happen often in the Pacific. The engagement report was short and cautious. No dramatic language. No claims of a breakthrough, just numbers. Ammunition expended. Casualties confirmed. Positions neutralized. But the numbers were impossible to ignore. Previous tunnel engagements in the same area had required thousands of rounds and still ended with American wounded. McKenna's report showed fewer than 200 rounds fired and 0 casualties on his side. By that afternoon, supply officers were fielding questions they hadn't heard before. Do we have more of the heavy belts? Or which guns are issued that ammunition? Who decides where it goes next? To CH, end quote. The ammunition didn't have an official nickname yet. It didn't need one. Among the crews, it became the new stuff, the kind you didn't waste, the kind you saved for the dark. By the second night, other machine gun teams were using it, not recklessly, carefully, short bursts, controlled fire, exactly as instructed. The results were consistent. Tunnel entrances that had survived days of bombardment began collapsing after minutes of engagement. Fires ignited in places that had never burned before. Most importantly, Japanese defenders stopped holding positions under machine gun fire. They withdrew, sometimes immediately, sometimes after the first flashes, sometimes after hearing it used nearby. That reaction was new. Japanese doctrine had relied heavily on concealment and endurance. Tunnel systems weren't just physical protection, they were psychological armor. As long as the earth remained intact, defenders believed they could wait out any amount of fire. That belief shattered quickly. Captured documents and interrogation reports began mentioning the same phenomenon. A machine gun that didn't just suppress, but destroyed cover. A weapon that made the ground itself dangerous. The name emerged from those reports. Kaminari-ju, thunder machine. Not because of volume, not because of rate of fire. Because thunder comes from above, and this came from everywhere. Each impact flash turned darkness into exposure. Each explosion announced that concealment had failed. Positions that once felt untouchable became liabilities. Japanese engineers attempted to adapt. Tunnel entrances were reinforced with salvaged steel plates. Timber supports were buried deeper. Earthworks were thickened. It helped, but only partially. The new ammunition wasn't designed to punch through armor. It didn't need to. The incendiary effect heated metal rapidly. Burning fragments ricocheted into openings. Air inside tunnels filled with heat, smoke, and panic. Defenders abandoned positions not because they were killed, but because staying meant burning alive in a space that no longer protected them. The psychological impact was measurable. After-action reports from multiple units noted increased enemy withdrawals during machine gun engagements. Positions that previously required flamethrowers or close assault teams were now neutralized from a distance. American units began changing behavior as well. Machine gun crews became more aggressive at night, not reckless but confident. For the first time, suppressive fire actually suppressed. Officers noticed that perimeter breaches decreased. Tunnel attacks became less frequent. When they did occur, they were often aborted early. Word spread through divisions faster than official authorization could keep up. By November 18th, units across the 37th Infantry Division were requesting priority issue. Supply officers scrambled to redistribute limited stocks. Not every gun received it. Not every belt included it. Scarcity added to its reputation. The ammunition wasn't treated as standard supply. It was treated as leverage. The enemy felt it. Interrogations revealed a shift in Japanese planning. Tunnel assaults were delayed or canceled in areas where the Thunder machine had been used. Some units began avoiding sectors known to be equipped with the new ammunition. For the first time, American firepower influenced where the enemy chose to fight. That shift mattered. Tunnel warfare had allowed smaller Japanese units to stall larger forces. Every delayed advance bought time. Every stalled position drained resources and morale. Removing that advantage even partially changed the tempo of operations. But the new ammunition wasn't a miracle. It came with costs. The bright impact flashes that terrified defenders also revealed firing positions. Enemy mortar teams began targeting machine gun flashes. Casualties among crews firing the new ammunition increased. Commanders issued new instructions. Fire in short bursts. Cease fire. Relocate. Shoot and scoot tactics previously reserved for heavier weapons were adapted for .30 caliber machine guns. Crews learned to trade precision for survival. Maintenance requirements increased. Barrel changes became mandatory after fixed intervals. Cleaning procedures grew more demanding. Ammunition stocks had to be rotated constantly to avoid degradation in the humid Pacific climate. And there was the issue of cost. Each round was significantly more expensive than standard ball ammunition. Production could not meet demand. Distribution had to be prioritized. Even at its peak, the Thunder machine was never everywhere. But it didn't need to be. Its impact wasn't measured in total rounds fired. It was measured in behavior changed. The enemy no longer assumed the ground would protect him. American units no longer assumed night favored the tunnels. That balance, fragile and temporary, was enough to alter how battles unfolded. And for the men who had spent weeks firing into darkness with no effect, the change was immediate and unforgettable. For the first time, machine gun fire didn't just make noise. It forced decisions, and in war, forcing the enemy to decide quickly, under pressure, without certainty, is often more decisive than killing him outright. The Thunder machine worked. That was never in doubt after Bougainville. But nothing in war works for free. The same flashes that tore open tunnels and shattered concealment created a new problem almost immediately. Every impact produced light. Every burst announced a position. In the darkness of the jungle, those orange flashes could be seen from hundreds of yards away. The enemy adapted quickly. Japanese mortar teams learned to wait for the flash, then fire. Artillery observers used the bursts as reference points. Machine gun crews firing the new ammunition began to draw counterfire far more often than those using standard belts. The numbers reflected it. Units reported a sharp increase in counter-battery casualties during night engagements where the new rounds were used. The Thunder machine broke concealment on both sides. Commanders issued new guidance. Machine guns were no longer to fire sustained bursts from fixed positions. Crews were instructed to fire short engagements, cease immediately, and relocate before enemy rounds arrived. What had once been a static defensive weapon was now forced into mobility. Shoot, move, wait, shoot again. 4. .30 caliber crews. This was unfamiliar territory, but visibility wasn't the only cost. Heat became a serious concern. The M1919 was a reliable weapon, but it was never designed to fire ammunition that detonated on impact with solid surfaces. Each explosive reaction transferred additional stress back into the system. Barrels heated faster, residue built up more aggressively, and when temperatures climbed too high, the consequences were severe. Occasionally, a round detonated too early, not in flight but inside the barrel. When that happened, the weapon was instantly disabled. Barrels split, receivers warped. In rare cases, crew members were injured or killed by fragments from their own gun. The risk wasn't theoretical, it was documented. After-action and maintenance reports began listing incidents of premature detonation. Investigations traced most of them to overheated barrels and sustained fire beyond recommended limits. The solution wasn't technological, it was procedural. Crews were ordered to limit burst length strictly. Barrel changes became mandatory after fixed round counts, regardless of visible wear. Cooling pauses were enforced even during contact. Violations weren't treated as tactical errors, they were treated as safety failures. The Thunder Machine demanded discipline. Another limitation emerged from the environment itself: humidity. The Pacific didn't just rot uniforms and equipment, it degraded ammunition. The incendiary mixture inside the new rounds was sensitive to moisture. Extended exposure reduced reliability. Some rounds fired normally but failed to detonate on impact. Others detonated inconsistently. Supply officers learned to rotate stocks aggressively. Ammunition that sat too long in tropical conditions became unpredictable. Fresh shipments were prioritized for frontline units. Older stocks were relegated or discarded. And then there was cost. Each Thunder Machine round required precision manufacturing, specialized components, tight tolerances. The cost per unit was several times higher than standard ball ammunition. Production could not scale indefinitely. Factories shifted capacity, but demand always outpaced supply. Even at peak output, the new ammunition represented only a fraction of total 30-06 production. Distribution was selective. Priority went to units facing extensive tunnel systems or fortified positions. Most machine guns never saw it. Those that did treated it differently. It wasn't something you wasted on suppressive fire. It wasn't something you fired blindly. It was ammunition you saved for moments when concealment mattered more than volume. This reality stripped away any illusion of a wonder weapon. The Thunder Machine didn't replace tactics. It didn't eliminate risk. And it didn't make night fighting safe. What it did was change the equation. It forced commanders to think in terms of effect rather than volume. It forced machine gun crews to balance aggression with survival. And it forced the enemy to accept that underground positions were no longer invulnerable. But the price was constant vigilance. Every burst carried risk. Every flash invited retaliation. Every engagement demanded restraint. As its use spread, so did awareness of its limitations. The Thunder Machine was not a solution for every fight. It was a specialized answer to a specific problem, one that required careful handling. And as the war pushed toward its conclusion, priorities shifted. Larger operations loomed. Amphibious landings, urban fighting, new theaters with different terrain and different demands. Resources were redirected. Production lines were adjusted. The ammunition remained in service, but its moment of prominence was already narrowing. For the soldiers who used it, the memory was clear. They remembered the first time the jungle lit up. The first time tunnels collapsed under machine gun fire. The first time the ground failed the enemy. They also remembered the danger, the heat, the counterfire, the knowledge that a mistake could kill them as easily as it killed the men hiding underground. The Thunder Machine had given them an edge, but it demanded respect. And in war, weapons that demand respect rarely survive peacetime. They are too dangerous, too controversial, too difficult to justify once the emergency passes. That reality would matter more than anyone realized. Once the fighting stopped, by the time the war in the Pacific began drawing to a close, the Thunder Machine was no longer new. It was known, it was understood, and it was already becoming inconvenient. As American forces advanced, island by island, tunnel warfare remained a threat, but it was no longer the defining obstacle it had been in 1943 and early 1000 M1944. Air superiority tightened. Naval gunfire intensified. Amphibious doctrine matured. Entire defensive networks were being bypassed or crushed under overwhelming force. The problem the Thunder Machine had been created to solve was still real, but it was no longer central. And in war, relevance determines survival. Production continued into early 1945. But quietly, there were no press releases, no battlefield announcements. The ammunition existed in a strange limbo. Officially issued, unofficially rationed, tactically valued but strategically awkward. Then the war ended. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Thunder Machine lost the only protection it had ever enjoyed: necessity. In peacetime, weapons are no longer judged by what they accomplish under fire. They are judged by what they represent. And the Thunder Machine represented something uncomfortable. It was ammunition designed not simply to kill, but to destroy shelter, to turn cover into liability, to make survival itself uncertain even when a soldier followed doctrine perfectly. That distinction mattered. In the months following the war, military planners began reviewing weapon systems through a different lens. International discussions about the laws of war were accelerating. Concepts like unnecessary suffering and proportionality, often ignored during active combat, returned to the table. The Thunder Machine drew attention. Officially, the reasoning was technical and legal. The incendiary explosive components were considered problematic under emerging norms. The risk of misuse was cited. So was the potential danger to crews. Unofficially, there was another reason. The ammunition didn't fit the story of victory. World War II was already being framed as a triumph of industry, coordination, and overwhelming force. Tanks, aircraft, ships, and iconic infantry weapons dominated the narrative. The Thunder Machine was none of those. It was small, quietly effective, and morally ambiguous. It didn't symbolize power. It symbolized adaptation. That made it easy to remove. Stocks were classified. Documentation was restricted. Production lines were shut down. Millions of rounds were destroyed in controlled burns. Others were sealed away in depots, labeled, logged, and forgotten. No ceremony marked its disappearance. It didn't fail. It wasn't replaced. It was simply erased. For a brief moment, the Korean War threatened to resurrect it. As American and Allied forces encountered tunnel systems once again, ordnance officers remembered the ammunition that had worked before. Depot records were reviewed. Remaining stockpiles were inspected. The results were disappointing. Years of storage, even under controlled conditions, had degraded the rounds. Failure rates were unacceptably high. Some detonated weakly, others failed to detonate at all. Restarting production would have required rebuilding precision manufacturing lines that no longer existed. The idea was abandoned. Instead, the military invested in new systems, larger calibers, heavier platforms, more visible solutions. The Thunder Machine faded back into obscurity. Its absence from popular histories wasn't accidental. It didn't appear in most infantry manuals. Veterans rarely mentioned it in memoirs. When it was referenced at all, it was described vaguely: special ammunition, the good rounds, that stuff that lit up the jungle. Or, even the men most closely associated with it returned to ordinary lives. Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna survived the war. He went home. He worked. He raised a family. In later interviews, he mentioned the ammunition only in passing, without technical detail, without emphasis. For him, it had never been a breakthrough. It had been a solution. Others weren't as fortunate. Crewmen who fired the Thunder Machine also paid its price. Some were killed later in the war, operating the same machine guns, using the same ammunition under different circumstances. Their stories merged into the larger tide of history, and the officers who had championed the ammunition watched it vanish. Private correspondence from ordnance engineers in the post-war years revealed frustration. They believed the Thunder Machine represented a fundamental insight, that small changes at the component level could produce outsized tactical effects. But insight does not guarantee legacy. Victory has a way of simplifying memory. By the 1950 seconds, the Thunder Machine existed only in scattered reports and restricted files. By the 1970 seconds, those restrictions loosened, but by then, few knew what to look for. When declassified documents finally surfaced decades later, they revealed a weapon system that had quietly reshaped a phase of jungle warfare and then disappeared without debate. Not because it was ineffective, but because it had done its job too well, too narrowly, and at the wrong moment in history. The Thunder Machine was never meant to be permanent. It was born from urgency, refined under pressure, and discarded once that pressure disappeared. In war, necessity justifies adaptation. In peace, adaptation demands explanation. The Thunder Machine offered none that fit comfortably, and so it was erased not by defeat, not by obsolescence, but by victory itself. The Thunder Machine disappeared from service, but it did not disappear from engineering. It left behind an idea, and ideas are harder to destroy than ammunition. Long after the last M1919 rounds were burned or sealed away, the problem they had solved never truly went away. Soldiers continued to fight enemies who relied on concealment. Fortifications evolved. Terrain changed, but the central challenge remained the same. How do you defeat an enemy you cannot see? In the decades that followed World War II, weapons development focused on scale. Larger calibers, heavier platforms, precision-guided munitions, air power, armor. The answers became louder, more complex, and more expensive. But quietly, in laboratories and proving grounds, engineers kept returning to the same principle the Thunder Machine had revealed. Effect matters more than penetration. A bullet does not need to pass through a target to be decisive. Sometimes, it needs to change the environment around that target. That lesson reappeared under different names. Observation rounds, incendiary projectiles, high-explosive incendiary ammunition for larger calibers. In heavy machine guns and autocannons, explosive projectiles became standard. Their purpose was not simply to destroy armor, but to create visible impact, fragmentation, and shock, to make concealment unreliable. The logic was familiar. What changed was the scale. Where the Thunder Machine had achieved this effect in a 30 caliber round, later systems did it with 50 caliber ammunition, 20 millimeters cannons, and beyond. These were safer to manufacture, easier to justify, and more compatible with post-war doctrine. The concept survived. The execution did not. Modern armies never returned to an infantry portable explosive small arms round comparable to the M1919. The reasons were practical and political. Miniaturization increases risk. Risk increases liability. Liability increases scrutiny. And scrutiny favors visible platforms over invisible decisions. Yet the Thunder Machine's influence can still be seen not in what was built, but in how problems are framed. Modern ammunition designers speak openly about effects on target, about defeating cover rather than individuals, about shaping behavior rather than maximizing lethality. Those ideas did not originate in the Cold War. They were tested in the Pacific jungle, under pressure, by necessity. The irony is that most people misunderstand what the Thunder Machine actually proved. It did not prove that explosive bullets were superior. It did not prove that technology alone wins battles. It proved something far less comfortable, that a small technical change, applied at the right point in a system, can overturn assumptions that entire doctrines rely on. American forces did not win the Pacific War because of the Thunder Machine, but in the places it was used, they stopped losing for the wrong reasons. That distinction matters. The ammunition did not replace courage. It did not replace training, and it did not replace combined arms. It restored relevance. It allowed existing weapons to matter again in an environment that had neutralized them, and that is why it never fit neatly into history. Histories favor grand narratives. They celebrate platforms and personalities. They reduce victory to symbols that can be photographed and remembered. The Thunder Machine offered no symbol. It offered a lesson. that when a system fails, the solution is not always to add more force. Sometimes it is to remove the assumption that force was ever the problem. That lesson is uncomfortable. It implies that failure is often structural, not personal, that soldiers can do everything right and still be constrained by tools designed for a different reality. The Thunder Machine exposed that truth briefly, then vanished before it could be argued over. Its absence created a vacuum. Later generations filled that vacuum with heavier weapons and more complex solutions. Some worked, some introduced new problems, but few addressed the original insight directly, because the original insight demanded humility. It demanded acknowledging that the most powerful military on Earth had been temporarily defeated not by enemy strength, but by terrain and assumption, and that defeat was corrected not by innovation on a grand scale, but by a quiet, risky decision to let a bullet do something it was never meant to do. Today, museums display sectioned rounds behind glass. Labels explain their construction. Footnotes mention their brief use. What those displays rarely convey is urgency. They do not capture the nights when machine gun crews fired into darkness with no effect, the frustration of hearing digging without seeing movement, the relief of seeing the jungle flash back for the first time. They do not capture how quickly belief changes when the ground stops protecting you. The Thunder Machine's legacy is not measured in numbers produced or battles won. It is measured in the questions it forced. What if the weapon isn't wrong, just misused? What if the target isn't the enemy, but the space around him? What if victory depends less on strength and more on permission to adapt? Those questions remain unanswered in many modern conflicts, and that may be the Thunder Machine's final irony. Its lessons survive. Its name did not. The idea continues to shape warfare quietly, while the story that proved it possible remains buried, just like the tunnels it once collapsed. When the war ended, there were no parades for the Thunder Machine, no photographs, no speeches, no citations carved into memory. There was only silence, the same silence that had once hidden men underground. Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna returned home in late 1945. He went back to a civilian job. He built a life that had nothing to do with jungle nights or machine gun fire. When asked about the war years later, he spoke rarely, and when he did, he spoke carefully. He never described the ammunition in technical terms. He never called it revolutionary. He referred to it the way soldiers often do, as the rounds that finally worked with deputies. That phrasing mattered. To McKenna, the Thunder Machine was not a weapon that changed history. It was a tool that solved a problem long enough for him and the men around him to survive another night. That distinction separates legend from reality. History prefers transformation. Soldiers prefer solutions. The Thunder Machine did not end tunnel warfare. It did not make the jungle safe, and it did not eliminate fear. What it did was restore a balance that had been broken. Before its introduction, the ground belonged entirely to the enemy. Darkness and earth worked together to erase American advantages. Firepower existed, but it could not reach what mattered. Afterward, that certainty was gone. The enemy could still dig. He could still hide. But he could no longer assume protection. That shift, small, temporary, and easily overlooked, changed behavior on both sides. And behavior, more than weapons, decides outcomes. Yet once the emergency passed, the solution no longer fit. In peacetime, militaries do not preserve tools born of desperation. They preserve symbols of strength. Aircraft carriers, tanks, rifles with long service lives and clean narratives. The Thunder Machine had none of that. It was dangerous. It was specific. And it forced uncomfortable questions. Why had it been needed in the first place? Why had standard doctrine failed so completely? Why did such a small change produce such a large effect? Those questions are easier to bury than to answer. So the ammunition was dismantled. The files were classified. The story faded. But the pattern remained. Over and over again in modern conflict, forces have encountered versions of the same problem. Enemies who hide. Environments that erase technological advantages. Weapons that work perfectly until they don't. And each time, the instinct is the same. add more force, scale up, escalate. The Thunder Machine suggests a different response. It suggests that failure is not always a matter of insufficient power, but of misplaced assumptions, that sometimes the battlefield has changed while the tools have not, and that adaptation, not escalation, is what restores effectiveness. That lesson is not limited to warfare. Systems of all kinds, military, industrial, social, fail in similar ways. They continue applying solutions designed for problems that no longer exist. They reward volume over relevance. They confuse motion with progress. The Thunder Machine worked because it questioned a single assumption, that bullets only needed to kill men. Once that assumption was removed, everything else changed. The jungle lit up. The tunnels collapsed. The ground stopped being safe. And then, just as quietly, the lesson was set aside. Today, the Thunder Machine exists mostly as a footnote, a sectioned round behind museum glass, a line item in declassified reports, a fragment of memory shared among veterans who never expected it to matter beyond the moment it saved them. But its real legacy is not physical. It is conceptual. It reminds us that decisive change does not always announce itself, that the most important adaptations often occur at the margins, small decisions made under pressure, invisible until they reshape outcomes. And it warns us of something else, that once a crisis ends, the solutions born within it are often discarded not because they failed, but because they challenge the stories we prefer to tell about ourselves. The Thunder Machine was erased because it did not fit the myth of overwhelming strength. It fit a quieter truth. That victory is often achieved not by having the biggest weapon, but by allowing an existing one to do something unexpected. On Bougainville, in November 1944, the ground stopped protecting the enemy. Not forever, not everywhere, but long enough for men to live, long enough for lines to hold, long enough for the war to move forward. When the flashes faded and the jungle went dark again, the tunnels were still there. The fear was still there. The danger was still there. What had changed was certainty. And in war, the moment certainty disappears, everything else becomes negotiable. That is what remains after the ground falls silent. Not a weapon, not a name, but a reminder. When a system stops working, the answer is not always more of the same. Sometimes, it is permission to rethink what a single round is allowed to do.